Well, considering some recent events around here, um, as far as some of my recent work has been concerned, I thought that I might discuss gearing, and that seems to be a particularly popular subject where the Royal Enfield Bullets are concerned, and you often sort of see people saying, I think I'll gear my bike up, or I fitted another gearbox sprocket with one or two or however many more teeth than it had, and everything's fine and the engine's far more relaxed and can take it. And true, recently I geared up a BSA A65 that I was working on, but that was only because it was too low geared. It had the wrong number of teeth on the gearbox sprocket, and it really was revving way over the amount it should have been doing in any gear, and even in top gear it was just buzzing at, well, little more than over 50 miles an hour it was buzzing, so it needed gearing up to correct it and put it back as it should be. But when you've got something that's geared as standard, and especially something like the Royal Enfield Bullet, which especially in 500 form can be quite a thumpy sort of engine and feel like it's got endless amounts of power, it's quite easy to sort of say to yourself, I'll go up from the standard, what is usually on certainly the Indian Bullets then, a 17 tooth gearbox sprocket which drives into 38 on the rear. In the case of this Redditch one, it's 21 teeth driving into 46. But anyway, by the by, let's just assume, as they're more common, popular, whatever you want to call it these days, and they seem to be the subjects of much well, improvement, shall we say, in inverted commas. A lot of the Indian Enfields, the 350s and the 500s, end up getting geared up, and you often hear people saying, oh, I did away with my 17 tooth sprocket and put a 19 tooth sprocket on it, and the engine manages fine, it hasn't noticed it and whatever. Well, the engine has noticed it, and I would notice it if I was riding the bike, but it all depends on how you ride the bike. I mean, if you really do only want to use about half of the available RPMs and power that the engine can produce, then you probably will get a fairly more what might seem relaxed ride if you're riding along on a perfectly flat bit of road with no headwind or going downhill. But if you start to hit a headwind or a bit of an incline, you're going to notice it and the bike's going to notice it. And what will happen, I got this here as well to sort of try and help explain where I'm coming from. The bicycle. You imagine you're pedalling along on nothing. Now, many or most of us have probably ridden bicycles at some time. You're going along on your bicycle and you're cruising along, say, everything's nice and easy, pedalling along on the flat, going at a reasonable rate, and then you come to a bit of a climb, and all of a sudden the pedalling gets harder. So you can work your legs harder, pull on the handlebars harder as you pedal, or you can change down a gear or two or three or whatever, and the pedalling becomes easier again. The speed is reduced, but it's far more comfortable and feels a lot easier to pedal along than if you hung on to that high gear that you were in before. And it's the same sort of thing with these and when you gear them up. And what will happen that may not be obvious at first, and I can sort of back this up because I used to work on marine diesel engines, which if you bear with me, some of them used to have like a pressure relief valve in the cylinder heads that if they went over a certain pressure, because the engines were working hard enough to reach that sort of pressure, the relief valves would blow off, and they would do that if they were forced to work overly hard, or if the pitch of the propellers was turned up too high, which is a sort of equivalent of gearing. The propeller blades move like that, you could increase or decrease the pitch, and the more pitch you put on, the faster the vessel would go for the given RPMs of the engine. But in a situation where I was working on tugs that did towing, if they were being made to pull, sometimes it would be better to increase the RPM of the engine and decrease the pitch, and the pressures, the cylinder pressures would drop, the cylinder temperatures would drop, and everything would get an easier life as a result of doing so. And it's the same sort of thing with this. If you put your 19 tooth sprocket on your 500 Indian Enfield Bullet, and let's say you're doing 50 miles an hour in top gear, everything's hunky-dory, and the engine revs perhaps, what, I don't know, say 500 or 800 RPM lower than they would have been at that speed. You're chugging along on the flat, no headwind, that's great. But as soon as you get a gust of headwind or a slight incline, the engine's going to be labouring, and what's going to happen is the pressure between the cylinder head and the piston on the firing stroke is going to increase, or be increased, because you'll be opening the throttle more to keep going, and the piston won't be getting away from the combustion chamber any faster, so the pressure against the piston will be higher, and that'll be transferred through to your big end and your mains, the crank in general. So the engine is not more relaxed or getting an easier life, it's revving lower, but the temperatures inside the cylinder and the head are higher, your exhaust valve will be getting hotter. There's all sorts of reasons really for not doing it, and I've got to say, I've got a 350 Indian Enfield Bullet of my own, and I tuned that, and I went up from the standard 16 tooth gearbox sprocket to 17, which is standard for a 500, thinking that I've increased the power of the engine, it'll be able to take 500 gearing, and it can, but with hindsight and the way it works, if and when I get the chance, I'll be going back to a 16 tooth gearbox sprocket, because tuning it gave it more power and enabled the engine to rev harder. So the extra speed could have come from that, but by gearing it up, I made it harder for that engine to reach those RPMs where the increased power lies. So sort of robbing Peter to pay Paul really, and I know that I wouldn't do that sort of thing again, but it's just something that might be worth considering, and perhaps some people overlook, in that you can't just go gearing things up and expect them to sort of not only sort of perhaps go faster, but also you might get better fuel economy under certain circumstances. Lots of people say, oh, you know, fuel economy is increasing. Well, I don't know how these things are getting ridden, but they can't be getting ridden very hard, or perhaps properly, dare I say, I don't know. But I'm not one for going out of my way to raise gearing, and as an example, a 350 Bullet that my father's got, that he's owned since the early 80s, when he bought that, that was incredibly overgeared. It'd do something like approaching 65 miles an hour in second. Third gear, you'd probably just about sniff 80 on in favourable conditions. Stick it into top gear and all it would do is gradually slow down. And it turned out that it had a mismatch of wheel types and gearbox sprockets. I think the engine had come from a Bullet that had a 17-inch rear wheel, but this Bullet had a 19-inch rear wheel on it, so the gearbox sprocket was way too big and the rear wheel sprocket was way too small, so it didn't really stand much of a chance. But it was geared. The guy who sold it to my father said that in favourable conditions it might do 100 miles an hour. Well, it might down a very long steep hill, if you could keep the hill going for long enough for the bike to reach that high, but it certainly wasn't getting anywhere near that on a flat or uphill, that was for sure. But yeah, gearing, just it might be worth keeping in mind the theory of pedalling the bike and changing down. Obviously on a bike, when you change down on the rear wheel, so you go from a small sprocket to a bigger one, or a bigger one, and as you go bigger the gearing comes down. On the motorbikes it's usually the other way about. We usually change the gearbox sprockets, especially on things like the Royal Enfield Bullets, although on many bikes rear sprockets are, can be changed as well. But I think some people expect more than too much from raising the gearing, especially on these Royal Enfield Bullets and the Indian ones, and it just might be worth considering that it's not always perhaps such a great idea as some people think it might be.